Hello guys, PanzerMeister36 here. Today we are going to be continuing on with our Tiger 1, and we're going to be applying some color modulation effects using oil paints. Now I know some people don't like color modulation because it is, by definition, artificially creating highlights and shadows on your tank. However, I'm not going to be doing it with the airbrush. I'm going to be doing it very subtly with basically thin filters of oil paint to create some variation to the yellows and reds of the tank. My goal here is to make it, like I said, very subtle, but to add some more kind of differentiation between different panels and hatches and stuff like that. So kind of like how we added fake shadows before with the pin wash to emphasize details, now we're going to be adding highlights and changes in saturation to do the same effect. In a couple of areas, I'm also going to employ some dot filter techniques. Dot filters are kind of similar, but they're more used in generic flat panels just to kind of add some modulation to the flat finish. So let's get started. I'm going to start by adding the color modulation on the red-brown areas of the camouflage pattern. So for this, I'm going to be picking a light and dark color of the red. So I've got Starship Filth and Rust MIG Ammo oil brushers. Basically brown and medium red. I've got a couple of paint brushes here. I've got an AK Interactive 3/0 round brush. And I have a Royal & Langnickel Zen 73 series 1/8 inch angular shader. It's a mouthful, but basically it's a short bristled brush, good for blending. I would generally use Wilder enamel thinner for blending, but today I'm going to use this VMS Oil Expert enhancing medium. It's, if you read the instructions on the back there, you can either mix it with the paints beforehand or kind of blend it with them. And the point is that it makes them dry faster and more matte. That's really useful with oil paints because they generally have longer drying times than most other effects. And yes, I'm going to be using a MIG Ammo oil brusher. If you have the opportunity to, I would recommend you use modeling oil paints. So that could be the oil brusher. You could also use the Wilder weathering oils. I use these ones a lot. I like them. And I also have some of these sPzAbt Abteilung oil paints. All three of these are modeling oil paints. Now, if you can't get modeling oil paints, the best non-modeling, i.e. artist oil paint that I've found is Winsor & Newton Winton line. These are actually really good, but these are even better. Now, the oil brushers, they have these kind of fancy applicators built into the lid, and this is supposed to allow you to directly apply the dots of oil paint to the model. However, the brush is kind of big, so when you apply it, you get a mega blob, and it's way too much for the subtle effects that I want. So I'm going to wipe that off, and instead I'm going to take some of the oil enhancing medium on my paintbrush and then take the oil paint off a paper towel. This way I can be a lot more precise in my application and apply much more fine, thin areas of paint because we want subtle effects. I'm using the red here to make highlights on the brown areas of the camouflage. So basically any areas where I want a little bit of difference in the color, I can apply it along the edges of hatches or the edges of the turret roof. This is going to be very subtle once we blend it out. And on this boring flat area here, I'm going to apply some dots to give us variation. Now I have the darker brown color, Starship Filth, and I'm doing the opposite. I'm going to apply some shadows, also some dots on the flat boring area. Apply some more dots over here. We're going to use that to differentiate between that angle of the turret. More dots, and then we're going to apply some more shadows around the gun sight. Now immediately after application, I take my 1/8 inch angular shader and blend the paint out just by rubbing it into the finish. I do not have any thinner on my paintbrush because I don't need it. Oil paints have a long drying time. Even with the enhancing medium, I still have like an hour. So I just rub it in dry. Don't take that out of context. But I'm just rubbing it with no thinner. And I'm just, all it remains is a subtle, basically, filter of the color. So you can see that we have like a darker area around the hatch. And the hatch itself is a little bit more red now. That's the goal. We want subtle variations in color. I want this vent here to look a little bit lighter because it's kind of exposed. So we rub some red in there. Same thing with the gun sight. I want a shadow around the gun sight, so I'm rubbing the darker brown in around there. And then, because this area is flat and boring, I just applied the dots, which I'm going to blend. This is the dot filter technique right here. Beforehand, we were doing kind of like color modulation. This is more of a dot filter. You can use some thinner on your brush when you're blending the dots in the dot filter, but you don't really need it sometimes. So only use thinner to blend if you actually need it. I applied a second layer of the brown here just to better differentiate between this angle and the turret roof. This is a good example of how the effect is supposed to work. It's very subtle, but you can see that we transition from brown on this side to more red on the other side. And we're doing the same thing on the hatches here. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this being used on the hull, because I already showed you basically the entire turret process. But you want maybe the hatch to be lighter and around it to be a little bit darker. So you apply the two colors there, and then you just blend it once again with a paintbrush with no thinner. If you're using a much longer brush, you might need some thinner to blend it, but I find that this brush I'm using here, a really short bristled one, is excellent for blending, and therefore you don't need the thinner. Alright, so with that we've completed the color modulation on the red and brown areas of the camouflage pattern. Now it's pretty subtle, but if you look around the driver's, or I guess bow gunner's hatch there, you can see that we have lighter red, and same thing on different areas of the engine deck. It's subtle, but if you know it's there and you're looking for it, you can see that this hatch there is more red than the back of the turret right next to it. The loader's hatch is a little bit more red than the stripe of camouflage around it, which is more brown. And same thing with the angle of the turret here that I was talking about before. We have a very subtle transition between red to brown. On the boring camouflage here, we have a few subtle variations because of the dot filter. That's kind of the effect we're going after. So now let's move on to the yellow, and let's go a little bit more in depth. On the yellow areas of the camouflage pattern, I am once again going to be applying a light and dark version of the color, in this case yellow. I'm using wilder oils now. I've got dark yellow and light buff. And also, once again, we're going to be using the VMS Oil Expert Enhancing Medium. Same stuff as before. I think it works pretty well because these paints seem to be drying a little bit faster than usual, so I can work pretty quick. Now I want to take a brief pause and answer a question I'm always asked before people even ask it. People always ask me what specific color they should pick for their color modulation. And the answer is, it doesn't matter. You can pick basically any pair of just light and dark versions of the color you want to fade. So these are all pairs of light and dark yellow, and I would pick any of these. I don't really care, because the effect is so subtle in the end. As long as you have a pretty close color, that's fine. So I'm going to start with my darker yellow, and I'm going to do the same thing we did before, and better emphasize the edge of that turret there. Also apply it around some of the details to kind of make a slightly darker version in the shadows. So around the cupola and the hatch there, I want it to be a little bit darker because the hatches are lighter. Again, we want to make this hatch here a little bit different than the turret next to it. We want it darker around the grenade launcher there, and maybe some darker effects at the edge of the turret here at the front. Doesn't really matter, you just want some variation. It's so subtle that as long as there is some variation there, it looks good enough. So now I'm just blending it in. Once again, no thinner, just blending it with my brush, rubbing over the surface. I didn't really apply a varnish beforehand. I still have the satin varnish that I applied like 3 videos ago before I did the pin wash. I don't really worry about my varnishes too much. But I guess if you had a matte finish, it would be pretty hard to blend. So the fact that I have a semi-gloss or a satin finish on there right now does definitely help with the blending. Now that we've done the darker yellow, I want to go in with the lighter yellow. And once again, same kind of effect. I want to add some highlights to some areas where I want the areas to be lighter. So the hatches and the edge of that turret bend there. On the boring area here, once again, I'm going to apply some dots like I did on the red camouflage. I'm also going to apply some dark yellow dots again. And then we're just going to blend it. Super, super easy. And I don't wait very long before blending, like a minute or so. Now, here on the dot filter, I needed a little bit of thinner, so I got a little bit of thinner. I wipe as much off as I can, because if you have even the slightest amount of thinner on there, you're going to very quickly notice that you immediately rub those dots completely away. So you only want a tiny bit of thinner, even if you need it. On the turret bin here, that's another flat, boring area, so I did the same effect with the dots. Again, just some dots of the two colors, and then I can just do some vertical streaking motions, and you blend the dots 99% away, and all you're left with is the subtle variation in colors. And since you did vertical streaking motions, it kind of simulates also rain streaks and other weathering effects. Now, if my tank didn't have sPzAbt all over the sides, I would have done the dot filter over the entire side of the turret and the entire sides of the hull. But sPzAbt doesn't take a dot filter very well, so I didn't bother. I only did it on the turret bin here. And you can see that, it's subtle, but you can definitely see some variation and some subtle streaking there, and also fades the marking a little bit too. The top of the manlet is a good spot to pick for some highlights. I put some shadows or darker yellow areas around the gun there, just for some variation again, around the bolts, I guess. And I also picked a few spots on the gun barrel itself to make some variation in the yellow. This might have been a little bit too much, but hopefully it kind of blends out later on. I don't know, I like it. It looks pretty cool. Sometimes I will even filter the gun barrel itself with a dark red, just to make it look a little bit kind of warm and more weathered, I guess. Right, so now we're back on the hull, and I'm just going to briefly go over a couple of spots where you can see me applying the two colors. So here you can see I'm applying some of the lighter color around the edges of hatches, edges of the bow gun, around the driver's port, the top surfaces of it. Again, these are just highlights. I want these areas to be lighter. You just keep blending until it's almost gone, and you're just left with a very subtle variation in color, which gives you the nice highlight. I decided to add some of the darker yellow around the edges of these ventilators here, just to make them pop a little bit. So I apply some dark yellow, and then immediately blend it out. And you're left with a subtle shadow kind of thing. I'm also applying some more dark yellow around here for more variation. If you look at the hatch to the left there with the big circular vent on it, you can definitely see that there's some variation in the yellow that I got by just applying some areas of the two oil paints, and then blending them out, so you have just a little bit of a hint of the colors left. And with that, we have completed the color modulation effects on our tank. I think it looks pretty good. I definitely do a better job with oil paints than I would have done with an airbrush, because my airbrushing skills aren't that great. But I do definitely prefer doing this with oil paints, because you can keep it very subtle and very precise. If you mess up, you can just wipe it off with thinner and restart. You're not going to damage any of your previous effects. And the effect, it looks really good. I do like it. You can see we have some variation. The edge of that hatch is a little bit more red. Other areas like the top of the driver's port there is a little bit lighter. It's very subtle, but it has an effect. Beside that ventilator, it's a little bit more yellow. Areas on the side are more red. Raised details are a little bit lighter. I'm just kind of repeating myself over and over again here, but it's all the same, just using a couple of different areas in the tank. The turret, I think, is where it came out the best, because there's a lot of kind of blank canvas space here. So we do have that nice differentiation between that angle and the top of the turret there. We have some nice kind of effects around the edge of the hatch there. Looks a little bit darker than the rest of the cupola. And then around the rest of the cupola itself, I also made that area darker. But it's very subtle, but if you look, you can definitely notice it. The hatches are lighter, and the grenade launcher there is also a lighter color than the area around it. Hatches here are also lighter. And I do think that we also got some nice effects where we did the dot filters in the, I guess, really like 2 areas. We actually managed to get it done. Back of the turret, and also the plate here on top of the turret. Dot filters are great for angled surfaces, but I only really had these 2 to work with, thanks to the sPzAbt on the rest of the tank. Anyways, I think I've done enough explaining. I do hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, post them on below. I always read through them all. And once again, there is another Tiger on YouTube for you guys to go check out. Over on Martin's channel, Night Shift, he's also working on his own Tiger 1 with sPzAbt. His has a little bit more of an interesting finish, I guess you could say, but it looks pretty cool. And today he's going to be giving you guys some rust effects on the spare tracks, I believe. Kind of like what I was doing last week on my own Tiger here. Also, on screen right now, I'm going to put up a couple of other videos that I've done in the past where I show the same technique I did today, but on a Russian tank and a Panzer Grey tank for those who are curious. As always, huge thanks to my Patreon supporters. Those guys really help me out making these videos. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week. Goodbye, and stay healthy.